Welcome to the Future of Supply Chain, presented by Dynamo. Each episode, we sit down with leaders in the industry as we build the future of supply chain together. Let's get into the show. Here's our host, Santosh Sankar.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Future of Supply Chain podcast. I'm your host, Santosh Sankar, and joining me today is Dr. Tom Goldsby. He is the co-executive director of the Global Supply Chain Institute, right up the road from me here at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He is also the D. and Jim Haslam Chair in Logistics. Welcome, Dr. Goldsby. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Santosh. It's great to be on the podcast. I have to admit, I've been chomping at the bit for a while to be on the Future of Supply Chain podcast. I know you've had some of my friends and colleagues, the likes of Dr. Alan Amling.
Yep.
I figured it was about time that I got my shot.
Dr. Amling was our first guest in the very first episode during his UPS days still.
That's right.
And actually came back not too long ago as well to have a follow-up chat with us. But with that, I'd love to ask you, as I asked most of my guests, what's the Tom Goldsby story? How did you get into the wild and wonderful world of supply chain?
Well, thanks, Santosh. I appreciate the question. And, I, like so many people, feel that supply chain is something that found me rather than the inverse. I was an economics and finance undergrad at the University of Evansville. And frankly, I thought I'd pursue like a Wall Street career. About that time, Charlie Sheen was making, life on Wall Street look pretty good. He had Daryl Hannah for a girlfriend and all that. So that looked pretty appealing to me. But, the action of business, logistics, caught up to me. And I had an opportunity when I was at the University of Kentucky working on my MBA, really advancing my economics background, to do an internship at the Transportation Research Board in Washington, D.C. So I gained an appreciation for the application of econ to the action, the moving and shaking of business, transportation. And right about then, I also took on a gig with Valvoline. We were shipping bulk oil and packaged oil around the country. Just to date myself, I was housed in a traffic department, which we might have to explain to some of the younger listeners what that entails. But that's basically outbound transportation. And hey, I fell in love with transportation logistics at that point, decided to get my PhD at Michigan State. And I'll have to tell you, I came close to becoming a Nittany Lion. That was a great program they had and continue to have. Tremendous legacy in logistics there. But I studied under Don Bowersox and Dave Close, Ted Stank, and a host of others, luminaries in the field at Michigan State, and kind of had a hard time holding down a job since then. I got my PhD in 98, went to Iowa State for a couple of years, Ohio State for 5 years. My own MBA alma mater, Kentucky, for 6 years, started their supply chain program, only to boomerang back to Ohio State for 8 or 9 years. And then the timing finally got right for me to get to Rocky Top in 2019. And hey, I'm covered in orange. What can I say? And just they made supply chain look like so much fun down here, and I just couldn't help myself. It's been fun ever since.
And when you briefly kind of think about the UT Knoxville supply chain program, give us a sense of like shape and size student body. You just have recently graduated a new class. What are they up to, and how many of them are out in the wild now doing good for the world? Yeah,
no, certainly. It's really hard for us to keep count because we've been on such a tremendous growth trajectory within the College of Business, but also supply chain in particular. I think the number of undergraduate majors we have in supply chain at UT is currently around 1,700 students. It is the largest major at UT, and in fact, the largest major throughout the entire state of Tennessee at any campus. Like I said, they make supply chain look fun and cool, and it's really exciting that we're getting some next generation students. What I mean by that is that we've got the moms and dads that are saying, hey, you ought to go to Rocky Top and study supply chain. And kids, one thing that happened out of pandemic is that supply chain entered their vernacular. I joke that my kids who are in their early 20s have finally removed the air quotes from supply chain. When someone would ask them, hey, what does your dad do? They would forever say, oh, he teaches logistics and supply chain with those little air quote things. I think they've even realized that it's something more than what dad made up. But hey, in addition to those 1,700 undergrads that are declaring supply chain as a major, we've got about 500 graduate students as well across our various MS, MBA, and PhD programs. So it's a big, big deal. I think our enrollment for fall in the business school, Haslam College of Business, is going to grow from something like 8,000 last year to 9,000 this year. We are working on a new piece of real estate across the street to move into in a couple of years, but we need it now. Frankly, we're going to have to get pretty creative. But a lot of those students are online, so we're able to take Rocky Top to the world, which is wonderful.
That's awesome. So with that, I'm going to kind of jump into it. You've been sought out on a variety of topics over the years, and I'd love to open up with chatting a bit about nearshoring. And for some context here at Dynamo, we've spent, the last 3-4 years kind of ramping up a lot of the work we've done in the subject matter. And the thing that kind of sticks out to us is that sovereignty and national security are a key element in dictating which things kind of are nearshored, friendshored, exshored. You can kind of put whatever moniker you want on it. And so we're observing kind of at least the initial things that corporations and folks in our corporate network are thinking about and doing good work around related to semiconductors, batteries, composite materials, healthcare. Like these generally have an inelasticity, kind of going back to your days in economics. And I'd be curious kind of what your thinking is on this. What are you hearing from your vantage point?
Yeah, you're absolutely right with regard to all those things that have largely happened just in the last few years. A lot of it is post-pandemic sort of reactions as people start to realize our end-to-end supply chains, don't begin at our receiving dock and end at our shipping dock. Rather, we've got multiple tiers of supply going back to raw material extraction, process, refining, manufacturing, distribution. And it is, like I said, it's refreshing that the world is coming to grips with this end-to-end notion, but it's also very difficult to unravel. And I think we need a little context. It's taken, the better part of 4 decades to get where we are. And I think we got addicted to low-cost country sourcing. Organizations doubled down on that. Think about everyday low prices. I tell my students, how much do you think it would cost to build a television entirely in the US if you could even do it, right? And a friend of mine said if we were going to try to build a car, it'd be like 16x, right? So a television is probably something in the order of that if you could even do it, right? And so I think that the overtures that we're making, one as a nation and two as corporate entities, to reshore, nearshore, regionalize our supply chains, I think those are good steps. And you're absolutely right. We got to prioritize. If we're going to try to level this playing field, dare I say, all of our counterparts out there, they've been investing in infrastructure. They've been playing the long game with regard to securing raw materials that may not reside within the confines of the homeland. I'm making a lot of veiled references that I'm sure your listeners can figure out. But to be able to produce in country or nearby is wonderful. But I think we also need to realize those dependencies that go way beyond finished goods, right? And we need to recognize where those raw materials come from, whether or not we're willing to refine and process those things while still meeting environmental regulations, still meeting our transparency expectations, things of that sort. And so we got to come to grips with a lot of hard questions here, and we're going to have to be willing to make investments to make that happen, to try to kind of level that playing field. But I feel like we've been playing behind, frankly. I'll call it out. Obviously, the Chinese government's been playing the long game for a long time.
Yeah.
But just to play it out a little bit more, there's an expression that I use whenever I'm teaching supply chain, just about any context. This thing comes into play. And I hate to go into math for your listeners, but if they can visualize a very simple equation, it's got just a few letters involved. P, the letter P, subscript AB. And then we got an equal sign. On the other side of the equal sign is a function, D, subscript BA. What that means, the power that some party A has over B is a function of how dependent B is upon A. And I think we'll agree we've become pretty dependent broadly on low-cost country sourcing, right? It's an addiction. I got to break the addiction.
Yep.
But it's going to come at a cost. However, there is a dependence that goes both ways. I'll just call out China again. They're pretty dependent on us buying that cheap stuff. They need us to keep them fully employed. They need to sustain growth. So, while we get really caught up in, the Taiwan Straits and all those things, and I think we need to be very cognizant and aware of this potential that's there. We need to manage for the long game as well. I think there's also this interdependence, if you will, in which we find ourselves, and that's going to maybe keep things a little bit more on the rails with China. I'm a little bit more concerned about Russia and Putin. It's a different story. But we don't necessarily have that interdependent sort of relationship there.
It's interesting kind of you bring up geopolitics, because that's clearly an accelerant to some of the work that might have been sitting in kind of executive discussions or board level conversations that we're seeing is accelerating into, hey, let's go do a study, or hey, we have a study. Should we start thinking about the permitting process? Have we purchased the land? Like actually setting that forth into action. And I'd be curious, right? Because you sit in this really unique vantage point where you're able to be exposed to the world's leading practitioners at the Global Supply Chain Institute. Where's the signal versus noise? Because depending on the week, like I'll show up on a Monday to our weekly meeting and I'll say, guys, this feels like there's a lot of noise around this particular subject matter at times.
Well, what you've just expressed there is what we hear from supply chain leaders with which we have as you point out, good fortune to interact. There is chaos, the VUCA prophecy that we're living in an environment that's highly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's a military term that we've brought into civilian commercial sector. And, more and more people we expose that to, they say, yeah, that feels like where we are. That said, as supply chain professionals and to some extent, supply chain networks and configurations, they've been battle tested to some extent. I was doing a media interview recently about the prospects of the Canadian railroads, going on strike. And, something else I think we'll talk about maybe a little bit later is Port of Baltimore and the Dolly and all that. And it's like, I think supply chain leaders are just like, okay, what's next? We're having to be ready to pivot and adapt to things big and small every day. And where I challenge the folks is to do exactly what you said, which is to sort out, what's real from the noise. I mean, there are going to be some things that, call for firefighting. We become very adept at firefighting, whether it's upstream, downstream, or within our four walls. But to what extent can we rise above it? And to what extent can we not just build resilient businesses and supply chains, but we are really pressing for agility? Because resilience kind of pushes away bad stuff. And I think we'll agree that's good to have that capability to push away bad stuff. But agility allows you to find the opportunity when bad stuff presents itself. And that's where we've done some really interesting work in agility over the last 5 years, where companies seized opportunities that were put on the table before them that other companies said, let's try to be resilient, lock ourselves down, and buttress against the bad stuff. And these folks said, hey, by virtue of you buttressing, we've got opportunity. You're putting opportunity on the table for us.
And is there a good example of that? Like, and as I think the last 4 or 5 years, obviously the pandemic is top of mind for everybody. But I think it's rather astute how you described it, where you're probably sitting one of two camps. You're agile and leaning into dislocation and opportunity, or you kind of figured out, hey, how do I batten the hatches and figure out what the world looks like in 2-3 years when all this is blown over? But who's been really good at that agility element?
Great question. And we're fortunate at UT to be working in something we call the Advanced Supply Chain Collaborative. It's something that my colleague, Dr. Ted Stank, set up fortuitously in 2019, which is when I happened to arrive at UT, but he said, hey, let's create kind of a skunkworks research organization. What are the problems that are keeping you up at night that you don't feel you have the resource, the time, the expertise, what have you to address? Throw them over to us and we'll work them for a year. And back in the summer of 2019, we had 5 or 6 companies that had the wisdom to say, hey, we'd like to have a little more agility. Think about 2019. It was almost like innocent times, pre-pandemic. Yeah. We did have tariffs and people were talking China +1 and all that stuff. And we thought, woe is us, and so, however, once we got into spring 2020, those organizations said, hey, those things you're modeling in your workshop on simulation, we want to implement those things. And by the way, is there any chance you could look at this value stream and see what happened if ... fill in the blank. One company we work, great company, a partner of ours is Bush Brothers right here in Knoxville, Tennessee. You know them for beans. I think they got like 80% market share in baked beans. And
yep.
But if you can believe it, they take to market over 250 SKUs. Just, people just,
if I
how
think
many
about
different
the aisle,
yeah. Of course, in different size cans and packs and all that, but over 250 varieties. And what they did in essence in pandemic, once it became clear to people that this pandemic wasn't going to be a flash in the pan, 1 or 2 weeks of inconvenience. No, we're going to do homework, homeschool, home play, home recreation, lockdowns and all that. And as soon as people felt comfortable doing a little bit of grocery shopping and kind of throwing their elbows, trying to get, hand sanitizer and all that stuff, they headed to the staple food products like beans. And those cupboards, those shelves were getting pretty bare, as you get into April, May. And what those folks did is they changed the problem. And my students in my supply chain planning class, I joke that if it were a drinking game, the number of times you hear Professor Goldsby say, change the problem, you'd be lit, by the time we get to the first break. But how do we not accept bad forecasts that are getting worse all the time? Well, let's try to become more operationally responsive, reduce the forecast horizon, respond closer to real-time demand signals rather than speculation of what might happen in 30 days, right? Yep. We need to react more in the moment. And so we need to work on our capacities. We need to work on our flexibility, but we also need to work on our planning. And we found that so many degrees of freedom could be gained if we worked on better alertness, better decisiveness, and acting on the latest intel that we can gather, working with unstructured data. Hey, what are folks saying online? Oh, they're moving to canned goods. We better get ready for it. Also, things like reducing the SKU count, which is very something in supply chain. We know that this works, right? Reduce the SKU count. We'll be able to forecast more accurately, run the lines more precisely for longer, make the assets sweat. And they were able to do all those things. And so we've got a really great example right here in Bush Brothers. They achieved record sales, record market share, record profits. And they even hired number 16, Peyton Manning, to become their chief bean ambassador and started running Super Bowl ads. That's a sub-billion-dollar company that's running Super Bowl ads now because they have the capacity and ability to meet the market. So that's one example. We were able to take that story out to our alumni magazine, which was really cool to share how, our research in the moment was allowing them to cast light, to change speculation into decisions that they were able to implement in the moment and win business.
So I'm going to switch gears on you here. Sure. Parcel e-com, right? Obviously, kind of the COVID era of a few years ago was a monumental time for e-com and digital penetration around shopping and demand, if you would, as we think about supply demand. But I'd love to take a step back here before we dive a bit more into it. Could you educate at a high level our audience who may not fully appreciate or understand how Parcel works today, vis-a-vis a brand in Knoxville, Tennessee, who needs to deliver on a customer order in, let's call it, Fort Worth, Texas? How does this practically work?
Yeah, well, it's changing a lot, right? And by virtue of a lot more shipment of eaches, as I refer to it, right? I mean, our supply chains by and large were designed for full pallet in, full pallet out operations. Let's get product to retail store shelves, and then kind of, hey, we've done our job. Hey, consumer, come in and do the order picking, if you will, within the confines of our store. And now that picking is done by an industrial worker. I mean, we got to recognize that the number of warehouse workers we have in the United States is more than double what we had 10 years ago. And obviously, we're looking to the Amazon effect, right? One of our own graduates, Dave Clark, helped to build out that network at Amazon. And, now, what is it, like 300 FCs, fulfillment centers that they're operating around the country, where it's those industrial workers that are doing the pick, pack, ship as opposed to the consumer. And that last mile, boy, it's a heavy lift, right? It is a function of where the pallet breaks down, because the economics change fundamentally from when you go from pallet to case to item. And the longer that distance is, particularly given the diabolical consumer that we are serving today, Santosh, I suspect you're diabolical like me, right? We're more demanding in every aspect of the customer experience.
Where we want it, even how we want it, depending on who you're ordering it from.
And we want free shipping, which we know there's no such thing as free shipping. We want free, no questions asked, hassle-free returns, all that, right? And all that stuff comes with cost. It's been this incredible pursuit of that customer experience. And so that led to another advanced supply chain collaborative project that we undertook. I think that Dr. Alan Amling, back in the 100th episode he was on with you, I think talked about the work that we were undertaking a few years ago, trying to wrap our heads around how in the world are you supposed to make money doing this? And as it turns out, there wasn't, a way to really do it. Great opportunity for service providers like 3PLs to step in and go, hey, we can help to reduce the bleeding here. We can do it a lot better than you, and share the assets. So the idea of shared logistics very much came into play. But with regard to Parcel, and you talk about those traditional service providers, whether it's UPS, FedEx, Postal Service, we're seeing not evolution, we're seeing revolution in that space. And it's not necessarily in that last mile. A lot of it's in the middle mile segment, also in that first mile segment. And so we're seeing so much rapid change around it as folks realize, okay, I've been beating my head against the wall for the past decade trying to figure out how to make money through this model. Maybe we go to a crowdsource element. Maybe we really open up the playbook here and get away from just trying to achieve density and make those assets sweat. Maybe we got to be a little bit more non-traditional in the way we approach not just last, but maybe first, and perhaps even that middle mile. And so it's really fascinating as an observer. A lot of times I count my lucky stars, that I'm not out there trying to figure out how to make money doing this, but I get to watch it all happen. Yeah. And again, incredible dynamics.
And, of late, over the last few weeks, as I think about headlines, even USPS kind of freaked some folks out because they were talking about incentives relative to how they're evaluating changes and inducting Parcel into their network that, to your point, has a lot of repercussions on first and middle mile, forget last mile. But then Walmart has equally said, hey, we've been able to improve costs, I think, by an order of 40%. In our last mile, but it's all because of assets and flipping kind of the notion of how retail works.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, it seems like it was a little bit late to dawn on Walmart that, hey, having 6,500 store locations was a tremendous benefit, not only in reaching the consumer in the last mile, but critically also that first mile of returns, which I think we'll all recognize is far more costly than the last mile. As we worked on our last mile research, in fact, Alan and I, more conversations we got into, they said, we're getting pretty good at just understanding the physics, if you will, of last mile. And we're wrapping our head around economics and embracing a lot of innovation there, but we're not getting any better at the first mile of returns. And so subsequently, Alan and I took on a project that looked at the first mile of returns, which continues to to challenge even the best of the best, right? I think even if we had someone from Amazon on here, they said, hey, our entire system is designed to go out to the consumer, not to come back. And so the frictions of that first mile are something that folks are still trying to figure out. A return.
That's super interesting. Well, I'm going to wrap up here. I have this thing that I do called rapid fire. So I'm going to throw 3 things at you that could be current events, topics, themes, trends. And I'd love kind of your quick, immediate 15-second reaction to them.
All right, let's go.
First up, AI in supply chain.
Oh, wow. I've only got 15 seconds, not 15 minutes. I've already burned 10 seconds. Incredible potential. We've not wrapped our heads around it. We think there's tremendous potential to help us see, think, and act in the supply chain. So as you kind of break it down, I think AI has tremendous potential that we're only starting to appreciate.
Next up, and you mentioned this already, the Port of Baltimore.
Well, it looks like the dolly is finally getting freed up, and that's very good news. Certainly a lot of uncertainty as we head into summer and fall with East Coast and Gulf Coast ports and labor and all that. And I think the last thing that shippers using the East Coast ports need is any sort of log jam there. So it's really good to see that we're finally getting that liberated. I know that the other ports stepped up in a big way along the East Coast. So kudos to them, and it meant some good business for them for a time. But I think it's good for all of us that we've got that primary interface, particularly for auto inbound, outbound to be functional again.
Last but not least, trucking rates remaining in the doldrums.
Yeah, so I know you're down Chattanooga way, and our friends Freight Waves down there. I make reference to the outbound tender reject indices as an early read on what's going on in the market out there. I think I applaud what they've done to shine light on it. We're just waiting for that summer rebound to happen. I do feel that we're out of trucking recession. But it's such a quandary, whether we're talking about transportation capacity, warehousing capacity, you got to put down your bets in advance, in hopes of the market manifesting. And it just seems like we've been out of sync in both transportation and warehousing as to when to put those bets down. But, equilibrium, it's a tenuous thing. And, once you have it, you lose it. And I think we're going to approach it again. And, I think it's good for all of us. I'm pleased to at least see that shippers are trying not to be too advantageous of the circumstance. I always encourage my friends in the shipping community to say, hey, there are going to be good times and bads. It's a pendulum swinging, and you'd be wise to treat your service providers with respect while they're kind of in the doldrums. And so I think the smarter shippers are coming wise to that.
That's well put, and I think nicely wraps it up relative to your earlier statements about we need to play the long game here. So with that, Dr. Goldsby, appreciate you joining us, sharing your wisdom with us, and enjoy the summer up there in Rocky Top.
We've got big plans here. Of course, we got to get ready for the fall campaign that'll be upon us real soon, but the summer does mean we get to travel and maybe let our hair down a little bit and enjoy a little relaxation too. So it's coming at a good time for us.
Awesome. Speak soon. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Santosh.
Thanks for watching. Follow us at dynamo.vc for all the latest episodes. We'll see you next time.